Today we get into two big economic issues that impact almost every American. The first is the economics of higher education, where loan forgiveness and some form of free tuition are both on the table for the Democrats. Then we look at what we've spent so far dealing with the pandemic and what the road to recovery could look like. Today we talk to two economists to discuss the candidates' policy proposals and the overall economics of higher education. I'm here with Professor Robert Toutkoushian at the University of Georgia's Institute of Higher Education, and we have Mary Clare Amselem, a policy analyst with the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Robert, Mary Clare, welcome. What do you think Joe Biden's proposal to forgive student loan for low-income families and for free tuition for low-income families?
Well, there are certainly plenty of problems plaguing higher education today, but unfortunately, making college tuition free and forgiving student loans won't solve those issues. Forgiving student loan debt is simply asking American taxpayers, two-thirds of whom do not have a college degree, to pay for the education of those that do. And similarly, assuming that all students can and should go to college is not where policymakers should be at. Turning the K through 12 system into a K through 14 system or K through 16 system is not responsive to the needs of the workforce. We should be pursuing policies that diversify higher education options rather than pushing all students into a one-size-fits-all system.
And Robert, what do you think?
The term sounds nice where you say debt forgiveness, and as if it's almost magical, we can just forgive and forget that these debts exist. But, it's real money that has to be paid by someone. So somewhere the resources would have to, yeah, exactly. It's going to come down to the taxpayers, one way or another having to fund this type of thing. There's also sort of the incentive part of this, and that if we had a policy, a regular policy like this where we forgive debts for students for borrowing, it could end up encouraging students to borrow more because they may view this that, well, it's not really that big of a risk. I might as well sign up for the maximum amount of loans that I could take, and there's a good chance that I won't have to pay it off down the road.
And so let me get to President Trump's proposal, and he wants to restore private sector loans. What do you think about that?
Here it's almost the opposite problem. It's hard to imagine that changing the system away from the federal government giving subsidized loans to students to the private sector would really have much of an impact at all on student behavior. Arguably, when students make decisions about whether to go to college and how much to pay and how much to borrow, I would believe that they pay very little attention to things like the interest rate that's on a student loan or where the loan is coming from. So it's hard to imagine that change in and of itself having a big impact on behavior of individuals. And it could end up, costing students at the end if we privatize these loans, if the interest rates are higher on the privatized loans than what they are on the federal loans.
So why are the costs so high to go to university these days? I have stats here that in 78, 79, in today's dollars, it cost about under $18,000 to go to a private college and about $8,200 to go to a public one. And today, those same costs are over $48,000 and $21,000 for a public college. So why have costs rise so astronomically?
Well, I think two different things are going on. One thing that's going on in general for all types of post-secondary institutions is that the types of services that we're providing and things that we're being asked to do are more complicated, and they're taking more money and resources to do it. Research is very expensive. So in order to conduct research, you have to build laboratories, you have to hire faculty with the skills to do it, and not only faculty, but also staff and students to support all of this. Government regulations have been another possible reason why we've seen the cost of higher education going up over time in general. And also college, students themselves as demanders are asking for more and more things. They want more, better dormitories. They want internet service. They want a nice student union. And all of these things drive up the cost of higher education. Then it's even worse for the public institutions, because over time we've seen that state governments who are responsible for funding a large portion of the cost for public higher education, their subsidies have not been keeping pace with expenditures. So, if expenses are going up faster than your than the subsidies from the state government, it has to be made up somewhere, and usually that's put on the burden of families to do.
It seems like most of the policies that we talk about are geared towards putting more students in college and making it easier for students to go to college. Is that the right direction that we should be moving in terms of what our economy needs and what's best long-term for those students who are going to be taking out loans, et cetera? So Robert, why don't you take that first?
Sure. I think it's good to make sure that our post-secondary system has options so that students who have the ability and the interest and the inclination to go to college have the opportunity to do so.
And Mary Claire, what do you think?
There are plenty of problems with the current federal student loan program. Virtually 90% of all student loans that are out there do come from the federal government. And that has created a massive problem of tuition inflation. And so we have seen what's happened when federal money has entered higher education. It's become more expensive for students to pay out of pocket, making them entirely reliant on federal loans in order to go to school. And that money, of course, falls on the backs of American taxpayers.
So the theory is that a more educated populace is better for the economy overall. And certainly the people who went to college have a much higher earning potential than those who don't. So how does that work with the rising costs of tuition that we were just talking about? Is their earning potential outweighing that rising tuition costs? Is it still a benefit for them to go to college and make the investment in their future by taking out a loan? Robert, do you want to take that first?
Sure. So people who've done research on this, I've done research on this as well, show that even in the current environment, it's true that tuition costs have risen faster than inflation for a long period of time. But even after taking that into account, on average, the financial benefits that students receive when they go to college and earn a degree greatly outweigh the cost of whatever they were paying.
And would you agree with that, Mary Claire? Well, it's certainly true that many students do remarkably well when going to college. And for probably most students, it is a pretty good investment. You do significantly increase your earnings by getting a bachelor's degree. But that doesn't mean that this is the most efficient way that we can be educating people. And that doesn't mean that there isn't a significant amount of students who are worse off for having gone to college, meaning they took out a significant loan to go to college. They either dropped out or they left learning relatively little and weren't able to get a job that enables them to pay off their loans. Those people are often lost in this conversation, and they are unequivocally worse off for having gone. And so this begs the question, what should we be doing to our higher education system to root out those inefficiencies, to make sure that there are options for all those students who are left behind? And for those students who aren't left behind, who might be doing better, we should be looking at more efficient ways that we can be educating them. I think it's very difficult to make the argument that the price tag for education right now is exactly how much it can be costing to educate a student. I think those costs have astronomically risen past a reasonable level.
So you raised an interesting point that Robert and I were talking about offline as well, that about 1/3 of the students, correct me if I'm wrong here, who start a 4-year college degree don't finish it within 6 years. So yes. What about that group of students? And are most of them taking out loans and then they're also not getting the benefit of the higher paying jobs with a college degree?
I'm not sure if most of them are taking out loans or what proportion goes. My guess is that compared to the average student, those students who don't complete a degree probably have higher rates of borrowing than the other group. So, as we were talking offline, as you mentioned, I think those are the students who are particularly in trouble with regard to the return on education. They're paying this cost, they're taking out loans, and they're not completing the degree, and therefore their earnings on average aren't substantially higher than what they would be if they hadn't gone to college at all. The problem is trying to identify who these students would be when they come in the door. We know that, a number of students go to, let's say, less selective state colleges and have, lower high school grades and SAT scores and are more likely to struggle, but, they're 18-year-old kids. There's a large number of them who end up going to college and blooming while they're there and become very successful. So it becomes really hard to figure out, on the front end, which ones will be the most successful and which ones won't.
And Mary Claire, if you generally don't think that debt forgiveness is a good idea, what about for this group? Do you think something particular should be done to help this group of students?
Well, I would push back a little bit on the argument that it's difficult to identify this group. This discussion that we're having here about students who drop out after taking out a massive loan, that's the worst case scenario, but it's also a symptom of our federal student loan program that does absolutely no underwriting when they issue a loan to students. They give no consideration to whether or not a student is likely to do well in school, whether they have any plan to pay it back. There's no consideration to where they're going to school or what they study. Those are questions that private lenders ask students, or would ask students in a robust private lending market if we did get away with a lot of these federal student loans. So I think that those questions are deeply important to be asking before settling, an 18-year-old kid with an insurmountable amount of student loan debt that they have no conceivable plan to pay back.
And Robert, would you agree with that? Do you think that sort of assessment on providing a loan would be a good idea?
Well, one of the challenges is that students go through the admissions process at their institutions, and so you apply for admission. If you're accepted, then the college comes back with a financial aid package showing how much scholarships and grants and other things they'll give you, and then also including loans to sort of pay off the difference if that's the case. So for I would say for a lot of those students, having something where you have another level, would really mess up everything, where, some other group's going to come in now and say, well, you could go in there, but we're not going to give you the loan. And also keep in mind, with a lot of these students that we're talking about, the ones who are struggling, less likely to complete a degree, they're going to public institutions. So 3/4 of the students in four-year colleges are enrolled at in-state public institutions. And out of those students, even out of the students who graduate from a four-year public institution, roughly 30% of them don't borrow anything. So, in part, the statistics that you hear in the media about, Betsy goes to college and has $200,000 in debt, it's more the exception than it is the rule.
So are the higher debts that we're hearing about associated with more expensive degrees or, professional degrees that they may be going into, and the regular bachelor student doesn't have as big a debt burden? Is that the case? And we're going to have to wrap up after this, so maybe I'll get both of you take on that.
Okay, sure. I could just quickly add my part. The people that study financial aid and borrowing have found, exactly what you're saying. The ones on the tail of the distribution tend to be students who go into medical programs or dentistry or those kinds of things, or, they go to very expensive private liberal arts colleges. But they're a very small slice of the overall population. So when we look at overall borrowing, on average, those who borrow, I think the debt of graduates is about $25,000. But once you factor in that a large number of students don't borrow anything, the average amount of borrowing comes down to somewhere around $18,000. And if the lifetime financial payoff on average for students is, $400,000 or so, as the College Board estimates, borrowing that amount of money seems like a pretty good investment.
And Mary Claire, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, those massive student loan numbers that you hear, the $200,000, those are typically graduate degrees. So, for example, if you go to law school and you take out every single penny to go to law school, that's through the PLUS loan program, the Graduate PLUS loan program, which allows students to borrow up to the cost of attendance. So not just tuition, but living expenses, things like that. It's an astronomical amount of money that students can borrow.
Thanks so much for joining us. Coming up after the break, what we've done so far to deal with the pandemic and what the road to recovery might look like. But first, here's America Q&A, where we ask Americans across the country, do you think a university education is worth the high cost?
I truly believe that higher education is important.
I do have a bachelor's degree. I did go to a four-year private university. My parents split the student loans with me, so I guess I'll start by saying that.
No. I think that you can be successful without a university education. I think it is. It's such a brainwashing program, such a campaign of monolithic views and stuff like that, and I think a lot of people don't fit in there.
Having been overeducated and underpaid myself, I think it was still worth it.
It's curious to me because I'm a musician. So I never got my college degree. I've been playing music since I was 12 years old. I didn't need it for my career necessarily.
I think a university education is extremely, extremely important. I guess I have a slightly different perspective on cost because I come from a country where I was lucky enough to have most of my university fees paid for.
Anywhere you go to get a higher education, it has to fit within your lifestyle, your budget.
I believe that education is valuable, but I believe that we've reached a point where the cost outweighs the benefit.
Well, I mean, having credentials is worth pursuing. It should not be to the point where you go, when you get out of college, you're in debt.
Absolutely. It was to me, and I think it is to almost everybody.
Passed at the end of March, the CARES Act was a $2.2 trillion economic stimulus bill. The spending primarily included $300 billion in one-time cash payments to individual Americans and $260 billion to top off unemployment benefits, as well as the creation of the Paycheck Protection Program. In May came the $3 trillion HEROES Act. Today, we talked to George Seay, the CEO of Annandale Capital, to see what the road to recovery could look like, and in particular, what the consequences are of the choices we've already made. I'm here with George Seay, the CEO of Annandale Capital in Dallas. George, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Cindy. Glad to be here. Appreciate you having me on.
The $2.2 trillion CARES Act that passed at the end of March included a lot of things, and one of them was a $1,200 stimulus check to many Americans. And I know that some of them went to people who may not need it, but overall, what do you think the impact was of those checks?
I think it was a noble and well-intentioned effort on the part of the executive and legislative branches to get immediate relief to people who are really hurting at the time and at a time of maximum fear for the country, and I think it was very inefficient. And I think a lot of people got money that did not need it, as you indicated, but I'm not sure what would have been the more effective measure at that point. We were in a really rough spot, and I think the policymakers were just doing the best they could, and I wouldn't armchair quarterback them. I do think we need some more stimulus. I would have it more narrowly tailored to the needs, though. There's certain industries that are going to go under in large part unless they receive additional federal assistance, and I do think we need some more stimulus to keep our country right-sized until we get a really effective vaccine and antibody treatment so we can really eradicate this virus to the fullest extent possible. But I don't think what the Democrats are proposing, spending another $2-3 trillion, is a good idea at all. I think it's got to be tailored to the problem. And I think we have to start looking over our shoulder at the annual federal deficits and our growing debt, which is a real anchor around the necks of our children and grandchildren.
So what do you think the implications are going to be of that massive debt that we've taken on very quickly?
Well, I don't think the near-term implications are going to be that frightening as long as interest rates stay this low. But, you know, if you start looking at the 10-year Treasury note at 5% instead of 0.5%, you go bankrupt as a country pretty rapidly in that sort of scenario with how big the debt's gotten. And the vast majority of the federal budget goes to just servicing the debt as opposed to healthcare and national defense and education and everything else. So we're really staring down a horrible dilemma. And I think that whether you're a conservative, small government is best, or a liberal spend as much as you can politician, you have to realize that we're going to have to cut spending and raise taxes, or we will go bankrupt eventually for sure. And we've got to have entitlement reform. So we've got a multi-decade workout ahead of us.
And it looks like now with the latest jobs report, we're starting to get a picture of which jobs are going to come back and which ones might be permanently lost. What does that look like to you?
Well, we have to look at this every day as investors. And I think that you've got a real bifurcation across not just the U.S. economy, but the global economy. You look at some of the older industries, whether it's travel, leisure, hotels, restaurants, airlines, anything related to travel, and anything to do with major gathering places, whether it's sporting events or concerts. All those industries are still really facing bankruptcy and under the gun. Whereas you look at a lot of technology industries, and now that things are returning to a semblance of normality, the healthcare industries, you've got some vital industries that are actually going to come out stronger than they were before this happened. And the government has got to react to that effectively so that we have a holistic economy that prospers together in the years to come as we recover from this nightmarish situation, and we balance the equities across the private sector. And I would say that government really does perform a vital function at that point in dealing with these kind of things. And my friends on the conservative side of the aisle, which is what I'm on, are too slow to recognize that we're confronted with it front and center during this period. So.
And what do you think for those who have permanently lost their jobs in the sectors you were talking about? What do you think the future is for them? Are they going to move into these other industries? Do we know yet? What do you imagine happening?
That's really a poignant and vital question, because those are the most vulnerable and the people that are probably the most afraid right now. There's some that are unhealthy, and that's a much bigger concern. But economically, those who are out of work and facing an inability to return to their work, they're going to have to cross-train very quickly and move into industries that are hiring and are offering opportunity. I have children in the workforce right now. One's in the music business and one's in the art world, and both of those have been kind of turned on their heads right now. There's no concerts and nobody's going to art galleries or art museums. So I feel this very personally, and I think that people are going to have to get creative and embrace their survival instinct and acquire some skill sets that may not be what they're used to, but that will give them a chance to thrive in the economy as we move forward.
So is that what your children are starting to look at?
Well, I'm proud of my kids. They're adults, but there's always be my kids, and my son is sticking it out in the music industry and making a go of it, and my daughter's actively looking for work in the art world. So they're hanging in there.
So what do you think the next step should be?
I think that whoever wins the presidency in November, we're going to have to look at strong efforts to reduce the federal budget in non-essential areas. And I think we're going to have to look at entitlement reform, which is the third rail of politics, and people have been unwilling to do that, including the president. And I don't know how we increase federal revenues, but whether it's taxes or whether it's some form of economic stimulus that raises revenues just because there's more economic activity, but the deficit is unsustainable and it's unacceptable. And we're going to have to go back to a normalcy. We haven't had a surplus in our budget since the Clinton years, which were a direct product of the compromise between President George H.W. Bush and the Democratic Congress to raise taxes, and that resulted in the surplus that Clinton got most of the credit for. And it's been a long time since then. It's been almost 25 years. So we're going to have to move more towards revenue neutrality in terms of the spending we do and the revenues we take in, and we're a far cry from that right now. So we've got a long road ahead of us, and it's going to be a painful road.
Sounds like a tough road ahead. All right, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Cindy. I appreciate it.
Coming up after the break, we hear from people in 3 very different industries about what's changed under COVID. But first, here's America Q&A, where we ask Americans across the country, what approach do you think the federal government should take towards the pandemic going forward?
I think the federal government should take policies such as social distancing and the requirement of masks far more seriously than they are at present.
It's gotten harder for small businesses like this.
I think the federal government could be doing an enormous amount more.
Step 1, take it seriously. They haven't yet.
Well, I believe in freedom, obviously. But I do believe that masks are the number one thing.
Well, part of the Constitution is being the leader of the free world. In this case, the president. Part of your responsibility is to protect the people of this country.
I believe there is a virus, but I believe they're taking it too far to control us.
Especially the Michigan government here is a very good example of lack of information and conversation with the citizenry and a violation of our civic rights.
So I think listen to scientists. To me, it's not that complicated.
I don't think the federal government should do anything. I think it's up to the states.
I feel that we need to take an approach that will be able to keep our economy going, but also protect our citizens.
It shows that our government hasn't even learned anything from 103 years ago in the Spanish flu.
So I really think that there should be like a federal mask mandate.
I think there should be a federal policy about social distancing and wearing masks, and that the White House should not be involved in the development of a vaccine for COVID-19.
I'd say they should definitely follow science as opposed to just gut reactions of our current administration.
So I would probably like to see something being done for children who may not have as privileged of a background when attending school.
So welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us today. You're all from different industries, and there's different things going on in this COVID world. So why don't you each just quickly introduce yourselves and tell us what your industry is, and then we'll go around again and ask you what changes have been happening in your industry. So Monica, why don't we start with you?
Sure. My name is Monica Quinn. I am the festival director of an independent film festival called Moving Parts Film Festival. We are located here in Los Angeles, and one of the things that we focus on is inclusion of Black, Indigenous, people of color, women in film, actors with disabilities, LGBTQ community, and bringing those voices, those underrepresented voices to light. So with those stories.
Great, thanks for joining us. And Rogers.
Hi, I'm Rogers Healy, located in Dallas, Texas. My company is Healy Global Relocation, and we help our clients that are high net worth, high profile with all their buying, selling, and leasing needs all over the world. We also help them move, whether it's their pet, like our friend with the beautiful dog today, or their car, their personal belongings. But yeah, just anything with real estate and moving, that is what we do here at Healy Global Relocation.
Terrific. And Jennifer, how about you?
I'm Jennifer Cosentino, General Manager for the Green Granite Inn in North Conway, New Hampshire. We are a hotel and welcoming guests this summer, which has been very exciting.
Okay, terrific. So let's jump into it. Monica, why don't you start and tell us what has changed in your industry in this COVID world?
Well, I think the biggest change, obviously, is that movie theaters are completely shut down. So that has completely taken out a part of the industry that I don't think people were expecting. I don't think people were expecting film festivals to get affected. And so that's something we can't offer our filmmakers. So film festivals quickly had to become more innovative, find tech companies to team up with, find a way to bring it online and bring it virtual, which has definitely opened some wonderful possibilities. But yeah, things are definitely different than how they were before COVID.
So let me just ask you this. With film festivals going virtual, it means people, it's no longer a community event anymore. That means people can join from anywhere in the world. Is that a positive or a negative? I guess you can attract a bigger audience, but now you're in competition with every single other film festival, right?
I think that's absolutely true. But I feel like you were also in competition before with every other film festival. I mean, film festivals are always vying for submissions for filmmakers. There's certain platforms where you attract films, but again, they have access to every film festival there is. So I think that competition existed before COVID. And now I think actually it gives the underdog a way to rise up in a way. If you're quick with how you're going to innovate, if you're quick with how you're going to offer something, how you're going to create community in this digital world, then I think you are almost at an advantage as to where before the bigger film festivals definitely took all that competition. So,
Rogers, how about you? How have things changed in your world?
Sure. I think the response would be everything is different and everything is the same. I think that, real estate, especially residential, everyone needs a place to live. And on the commercial side of things, a lot of people needed a place to work. And then a lot of people also want a place to go on the weekend. So, the month of March and really most of April was just kind of, we didn't know what the heck was going on. It was kind of a mess. And I think it gave people, especially in industries like mine, just the chance to recalibrate and put priorities in place. And in the world of real estate, priority is your family and it's where you're going to live. So we've seen the 6 busiest months we've ever seen. I've done this for 20 years. It's the 6 busiest months we've ever seen in history, not just for my company, but for our city and, for really the market all across the world, except for a few places that have just been unfortunate. So it's been crazy. So we had to do, in the oldest historical sales job ever, a real estate agent, we had to go and learn how to be tech heavy and how to rely on things that we didn't rely on in the past. And that's computers and that's technology differently. So yeah, our industry has changed in the sense that we had no option but to be agile, but it's also been, refreshing knowing that people still, they're going to always be looking for something to make them feel safe and comfortable and at home. And right now being home looks a little bit different, where you probably need things you didn't need prior to March. So yeah, we've just shifted and we've followed the trends, and in a lot of ways we've helped set the trends. So yeah, it's caused us to be creative, which we've all been very grateful for.
So why has it been so busy? Is that because people are leaving the cities for other environments, or they need a house with different, they have different needs now? Why is it so busy?
Sure. I mean, it's a combination of a lot of things. If you think about, like, obviously there's been a mass exodus for the last few years from California, right? And then since the beginning of this year, there's been a mass exodus from New York City. And those people are moving, and when, it's just supply and demand, which is economics 101. And if you're going to go from New York City to Jersey, and all of a sudden one showing today turns into 15, it changes things. So we've just seen this stuff shift dramatically. And when people like me, I've worked out of my office for literally 20 years. And the past 7 months, I've been working from home. And just like the rest of us, we figured out how to do it. And we figured out how to be agile with something like, a movie, like it's historically in a movie theater. And how do you bring it to your home? We had to do the same kind of adjustment, and we didn't have the option but to make it work.
And Jennifer, how about you? Now, I know the hotel industry is suffering. I just read a report that 1 in 4 U.S. hotels is in danger for closure. Is that correct? And how are things going for you?
So I think it really depends on the location and where you are as far as the hotels. So I'm in North Conway, New Hampshire. It's a beautiful location surrounded by the White Mountain National Forest, plenty of social distancing up there. So we had phenomenal numbers through the summer and early fall. I think for us, and I echo Roger, is that it's the same but different. People come to the hotel, they want it to be the same, trying to show them what has changed, educate them on what has changed versus the guidelines and whatnot that has been set out. So for us in North Conway, there has not been a lot of change as far as occupancy. We actually could have had a higher occupancy this summer had we been able to staff the hotel fully, which has certainly been a challenge for us.
So why is it so hard to staff the hotel? People just aren't willing to work in that industry, or it seems like people should be looking for jobs, no?
I think there's a few reasons for that. I think one, you are working in the service industry in the world of COVID and making people comfortable and understanding the things we have in place to protect them as staff. Certainly has hampered that a little bit. And honestly, there was a nice little benefit if you were on unemployment this summer. And I think people took advantage of that to have the summer off and not have to work and have the extra $600. Certainly impacted our industry and our area. We had already had a challenge trying to find staff prior to COVID hitting. That challenge became even greater once everyone was able to collect the extra bonus on unemployment. So it really affected us immensely to a point. There were times when we could not sell all of our hotel rooms because we did not have enough staff to clean them.
We all know about, cleaning and social distancing and masks and stuff, but is there anything we're not aware of?
There's certainly social distancing. We have all of the markers. We have the plexiglass in front of our front desk. But not being able to do the overnight service if you're here for more than one night, that's been impactful.
So let me just get this right. You don't have overnight service, meaning you're not going in and cleaning the rooms, changing the towels and that kind of thing. Is that right?
Correct. We are not allowed per New Hampshire government orders. We are not allowed to enter an occupied room at this time. So we can leave fresh towels. We can leave fresh amenities. For them outside their door. We certainly will replace their trash. If they leave it outside, we'll leave a new trash bag for them, to refresh. But we cannot enter an occupied guest room at this time.
We've got to wrap up, but very quickly, I just want to go to each of you, whether you think these changes are permanent or not, and whether you think they're good for your particular industry or your business. So, Monica.
I'm going to say I am a optimist, and I hope that there will be a solution, there will be a vaccine, and we can go back to as things were. I would love to see film festivals return to how they were before, with movie theaters and red carpets and pictures and community face to face. I think that this is a good temporary solution. And I also feel like it would be nice to see the mixture of the two once things are back to normal, to still have an online interactive version of the festival to reach a wider audience and to make it more accessible for people.
Excellent. And Rogers, how about yourself?
I love it. I'm having the time of my life. I think people are just appreciating the little things more. And obviously this is not sustainable, but I think what we've learned is that we can do it in any industry, right? And so I do think there's some progress that's being made, but I think that the days of showing up to the office to work in any industry are in the past. And so I do think that also the trends that we've seen with people wanting to be home, wanting more space, wanting a dedicated room for X, Y, Z, that's a trend that's here. That ain't going nowhere. So yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of these things stay, from here on out.
Excellent. And Jennifer, final words from you?
So we certainly hope to get back to the new normal at some point. It was thrilling when we were able to welcome our guests back to the inn on June 8th of this summer. We continue to see it growing. I think as time goes on, as the virus goes down, more people continue to practice the social distancing, wearing the mask, do what we need to do. I think we will continue to see a wonderful winter season in North Conway, New Hampshire, and we're really looking forward to it.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today, and I wish you all the best of luck.
Thank you. Stay safe, everyone.
Coming up after the break, we check in with Roman Balmakov from the Epoch Times, who went down to Little Havana in Miami, Florida, to see what voters there have to say about the upcoming election.
The 2020 election is just a few weeks away, which is why we are here in Florida, one of the key battleground states. But a lot of people don't know that over a quarter of Florida's population are Hispanics, people who have either come or their families have come from places like Colombia, Puerto Rico, and largely Cuba, which is why we're here in the Little Havana neighborhood of Miami in order to speak to Cuban Americans, get a feeling for who their candidates of choice are and what issues affect them the most. So let's go talk to some people and find out for ourselves. I found that the best way to find out what people are thinking is to just ask. So we went over to Versailles, one of the most iconic Cuban restaurants in all of Miami. It's a real cultural hub where people come to drink Cuban espresso, hang out, and talk politics. So we took a walk around and asked people who they were voting for and why. Which candidate are you supporting in the 2020 election, if you don't mind me asking?
Donald Trump.
Trump.
Por Trump. Trump.
Este país. Trump. Donald Trump.
Correctamente, por nuestro presidente Trump, así mismo.
Por el presidente Trump, el bárbaro.
Porque Trump.
About 80% of the people that we spoke with told us that they were voting for President Trump.
Trump.
What's the biggest reason?
I think he has promised a bunch of things that he's fulfilled in every one of his promises, and I believe in everything that he wants to do.
Because I hate socialism.
Because he's not a politician. He cares about the people. He cares about individual liberty, which is what I care about. I care about being able to say what I want to say when I want to say it and not be ostracized for it. It's a great country. It's the best country in the world. Perfect? Far from it. But there's nothing better.
Many people I spoke with told me that a key factor behind their support for President Trump was the Democratic Party's shift further left. That's because many Cuban Americans who are living in Miami either escaped from communist Cuba or had parents who did. And as a result, they are deeply suspicious of leftist policy positions. They remember that before the Communist Revolution in 1959, Cuba was a relatively rich country. Certainly there were some deep inequalities, particularly between the cities and the countryside, as well as between different racial groups, but Cuba still ranked 5th in the hemisphere in per capita income, 3rd in life expectancy, 2nd in per capita ownership of cars, and 1st in TV ownership. But within 2 years of the revolution, Castro's regime confiscated more than $25 billion worth of private property owned by Cubans. And today, Cuba ranks 2nd to last in economic freedom in the Americas, only ahead of Venezuela. Many of the Cuban Americans who are living in Miami were among the 500,000 that ended up fleeing Cuba over the last 2 decades post-revolution.
When people go, they usually go just to Havana and they see like the beautiful touristy part that's actually up. The government does keep up and it's painted and everything. But once you go inside to the actual streets of Cuba, you see the buildings are crumbling. I'm Barbara Lopez and I'm a second-generation Cuban American. You know, these are buildings that should be condemned and unlivable, but the Cuban people have no other choice than to live in these buildings because they don't have any money, they don't have anywhere else to go. And, you know, there's what they call apagones every night for a certain amount of time. I think it's like 4 or 5 hours that the whole Cuban country, different provinces, they shut off the lights, electricity, completely. And that's supposedly to save money and the water. You see how they live, you know, they're drinking dirty water, their clothing, everything they're given to they're sent by their families here.
Jorge Monteguedo escaped Cuba in 1962. He and his family have been running a neighborhood pharmacy here in Miami for the past 48 years.
We're in Cuba, and that's what they came in power. You know, when Fidel Castro came into town, so they called him a saint. The saint came down from the mountain. He wasn't a saint. When he spoke the first time, they put a dove on his shoulder here. So people would say, oh my God, even the dove, you know, he means peace. And then the second thing that he did, he said, why do we need guns? And so by that, he took from everybody, he took the guns and knife, so he could do things. And that's what we're afraid here, most of the Cubans here, by taking away the Second Amendment, it's going to be, that's what they want. You know what I mean? They want that so that we don't have any power against the government. And that's what happened in Cuba. They took all the guns, and if they find you with a gun, they will take you to the paredon, you know, the firing squad. So that's one of the reasons that my parents sent me here.
One issue that I really wanted to know about, and that was, what effect was mail-in voting going to have on this election? According to the Florida Secretary of State website, Democrats have already requested nearly 700,000 more mail-in ballots than Republicans. So we wanted to ask both sides about their thoughts on mail-in ballots. Luckily for us, while we were in Miami, President Trump came to have a roundtable discussion at his golf course in Doral. So we were able to take the opportunity and ask both sides, both the president's supporters as well as the people who were protesting against him, about their thoughts on mail-in voting.
During this election cycle, are you voting by mail or in person?
I think I'm going to request a ballot, but most likely I will vote at the polls.
Are you going to be voting by mail or in person?
I will be voting on October 24th, which is the first day that I could cast my ballot. I cannot cast my ballot soon enough. So on October 24th, I will be early voting in person. If you can go grocery shopping, you could go vote in the polls. You can stand outside, you could pack a lunch, but please cast your ballot. Do not sit this one out. And I hope everyone uses their voice, because that's what democracy is all about. We all have a voice and we all should be counted.
I will be voting by mail, but I will be delivering it to our elections department, which is actually right here in Doral.
By mail.
I'm voting in person.
I will be voting in person. By the way, I received a mail-in ballot in my house, and I never requested it. So why am I getting it?
No, I'm going to be voting in person because I also don't believe, you know, what the Democrats are doing about the mail votes. I haven't received anything yet, but I'm watching. I'm going to go and vote in person.
In person.
What's your opinion on the mail-in voting? Are you going to be voting by mail this year or in person?
Going right there in person. I don't care if I got to stay there 4 days. I'm doing it in person. I want to make sure mine's counted.
Absolutely 100% in person.
And so this Florida election might come down to a very simple question: whether people will actually show up and vote at the polls on November the 3rd.